you get from the report, from the article?
Goods are of poor quality, and the service there is also bad.
The services are intolerable. The services are intolerable. Now, what are Soviet goods so poorly made, and why are their services so bad?
It has degenerated social imperialist.
The Soviet Union, under the Brezhnev rule of the revisionist clique, has degenerated into what? Yes, has degenerated into a social imperialist country.
What do you think of the Russians? Are the Russians really so bad?
Yes, I think the Soviet Union is very bad under the rule of the Brezhnev clique.
The revisionist clique.
Because I think the Soviet Union is no longer a socialist country. It has degenerated into the social imperialist country.
The play, performed so perfectly by the boys of a Peking commune, symbolizes China's defense against an enemy. The enemy is that other vast communist powerhouse, the Soviet Union. While both nations tread a communist path, their characters are very different. While Russian communism has been based on the struggle of the industrial working classes, China's grew from a peasant resistance movement. China claims that Russian communism aims at aggression and domination, while it seeks only classless equality for its people. Even to the outsider, it's a difference that's not difficult to pin down. The roots of Chinese communism lie in the soil. Strong emphasis on efficient, productive agriculture, primitive though it remains, has helped shape the kind of doctrine which guides the people. The Soviet Union is far behind China in food production, but stronger in industry. That industrial society has bred an unspoken hierarchy: managers, skilled workers, laborers. But here in China, everyone must sometime till the soil, and that way, it's claimed, everyone has a common class.
Hello everyone, it's your host Tony. Welcome to another episode of Actually Existing Socialism. What you just heard was a clip from a 1977 documentary in which communist Chinese university students were interviewed about their thoughts on the Soviet Union at a time when market and political reform was in the air for both countries, and when the tensions between these two communist juggernauts, China and the Soviet Union, are at an all-time high. If you're a new listener, this show is a podcast dedicated to exploring past, present, and future manifestations of real-world socialism by speaking to those who've studied extensively, lived in, or currently live in a socialist nation. In this episode, we'll be discussing Carlos Martinez's incredible book entitled The East is Still Red, Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century, published by Praxis Press. Carlos Martinez is an author and political activist from London, Britain. His first book, The End of the Beginning, Lessons of the Soviet Collapse, was published in 2019 by LeftWord Books. He's a co-editor of Friends of Socialist China, a co-founder of No Cold War, and a coordinating committee member of the International Manifesto Group. Carlos writes regularly for the Morning Star, Global Times, China Daily, and CGTN. In this first part of our three-part discussion on China, we'll be delving into why socialist China remains, but the USSR doesn't, and we'll be answering that question through the lens of how they separately approach the necessity of controversial political and economic reforms, which manifested in the 1970s in China under Deng Xiaoping, and in the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev in the 1980s. Next episode in the series will look at Chinese socialist democracy and the propaganda war against it. As you know, this show is 100% listener funded and a solo production, so anything you can spare will go a long way in having me continue this educational project, which requires research, editing, recording, and other work to put together. So if you do wish to contribute as a Patreon subscriber at patreon.com/AESthepodcast, you will gain access to a variety of bonus episodes and content. So shout out to my patrons, thank you for support. If you're unable to contribute in that way, no problem. You can help out by sharing this episode and by following us on Twitter at AESthepodcast. You can also subscribe to the show on your preferred podcast platform to get new episode notifications. Also, feel free to leave a review if you have time, or even just a star rating. I recommend checking out the back catalog as well when you have the chance. And as always, you can really help out the show by engaging locally in worker struggles, whatever form that may be. I am very excited to welcome Carlos Martinez onto the show. We'll be talking about his recently published and highly informative book entitled The East is Still Red, Chinese Socialism in the 21st Century. Welcome, Carlos.
Hey, Tony. Great to be here with you.
So, Carlos, your work, which of course I highly recommend for people to check out, for me personally has really concretized the reality that China is, in fact, a socialist nation, not just in name only, but in the acts that it carries out as a government, as a communist party, etc., and that it's not this antagonistic, oriental, despotic, anti-democratic regime that, the way, as you surely know, as it's presented in the West. Of course, me saying that isn't a statement, neither are you saying that it's a statement of the perfection of the People's Republic of China, but it's an acknowledgement of the sincerity of its project. That given its own material conditions, history, and culture, is striving to build a socialist society. So you're an editor of the Friends of Socialist China, and you're the author, of course, of this excellent book. You're a very staunch advocate for the People's Republic of China. Why have you taken that on as a personal and even a collective mission?
I guess it comes down to somebody's got to do it. It's obviously it's not a very popular political positioning. Currently in the West, people tend to be very anti-China. Of course, you've got people on the right who are essentially pursuing a new Cold War against China. Imperialist strategists see China as a threat, and they're starting to understand, or they started to understand some years ago, that China's not going to work out the way they'd planned for it to work out. They thought that with the adoption of market mechanisms, with opening up to foreign capital and all the rest of it, China would gradually kind of be drawn magnetically towards the US-led imperialist world system and towards a system of so-called liberal democracy. They've understood that that's not happening, that China's following its own path, that China is not going to remain permanently in a position of subservience in the global economy. And so they're pursuing, on the one hand, this military campaign of encirclement, of containment, and that includes things like AUKUS, this military alliance between Australia, the UK, and the US, the Quad, the third so-called missile defense systems that are positioned in South Korea and Guam, new US military base in Darwin in Australia, troops and weapons stationed in Japan, in Okinawa and South Korea and whatnot. Meanwhile, arming Taiwan, supporting separatist forces there, carrying out freedom of navigation assertions in the South China Sea. So you've got this military angle to it, and then alongside that and supporting that, you've got a propaganda aspect to it, a propaganda war, where you've got governments and media in the West essentially priming their populations for aggression against China, up to and including a potential war. China is presented as this authoritarian, repressive, brutal, undemocratic regime, potentially engaged in genocide against a section of its population. So, that's the right wing. That's what's coming from the right wing and from the mainstream. On the left, well, much of the left in the West just thinks that China's capitalist. They look at 40 plus years of market reforms, of growing inequality. They see that in the streets of Shanghai or Beijing or Guangzhou, that there's KFCs, there's McDonald's, there's Starbucks, there's all of these things that as, socialists and communists and revolutionaries ourselves, we're like, okay, come the revolution, we're going to get rid of KFC. But the Chinese have had a revolution and they've got KFC. What's going on? So, there's billionaires in China, I don't know, 600, 700 billionaires. So people just think, and understandably, I think, they look at China and they're like, well, this is not what we're kind of dedicating our lives to in terms of the struggle for socialism. This is not what our dream is. Of course, that's a flawed position, and it doesn't take stock of the incredible progress that China's made and how much better Chinese people live today than they did 70 years ago. My starting point is along the lines of, how do we explain China's successes? Things like, 800 million people being lifted out of poverty, the extraordinary, historically unprecedented improvement in people's living standards. China's become the global leader in numerous environmental fields, like in terms of renewable energy production, protecting biodiversity, developing electric vehicles, electric public transport, they've got this program of building 30 sponge cities now that have become the global leader in that. Obviously they were one of the leaders in terms of handling COVID-19 in such a way that as few people as possible died. It's gone from being a science and technology backwater, from being very backward in 1949 to now being one of the leading science and technology powerhouses in the world. You can go to Xi'an, you can go to Xinjiang, you can go to Qinghai, you can go to like the central and the west, you can go to the poorest parts of China, and they've all got this incredible infrastructure. And this is all carried on with a peace-oriented foreign policy. They've made all this progress, and it hasn't been on the basis of imperialism and domination. Like China hasn't been at war in more than 4 decades, all while, maintaining collaborative, non-oppressive relationships with the countries of Africa and Asia and the Middle East and Latin America and the Caribbean and the Pacific. This is something novel, what China's doing, and it's being carried out by a communist-led government in a massive country. The Chinese talk about their model of modernization, and they say it's got 4 characteristics, which are new characteristics for modernization and that stand in contrast to Western modernization. 1, that it's the modernization of a country with a massive population. 2, that it's carried out without recourse to colonialism, imperialism, hegemonism, domination. 3, that it features green development, that it's not based on the relentless and ruthless destruction of the planet. And 4, that it features common prosperity. So like everyone's conditions of life improve and not just those of the wealthy. So, this is a new phenomenon that to me, it's obviously worthy of study. If it's capitalist, okay, even then we should try and understand it. And maybe as leftists, then we have to update our worldview. If it's possible to achieve what China's achieved under a capitalist system, then yeah, we probably need to rethink a few things. But my understanding is that China remains socialist, and that's the secret of its successes. And on that basis, as socialists, as communists, as progressives, as Marxists, it's crucially important to understand Chinese socialism and what's going on in China.
The People's Republic of China was founded in 1949. Of course, it's still existing today at 74 years. The Soviet Union, which lasted from 1922 to 1991, only lasted 69 years. So it's outlived that socialist experiment. Among many other countries that kind of took on the path of socialist construction in the 20th century, many of them, of course, no longer exist, particularly all of the Soviet socialist republics. So why is China still ruled by a communist party? Why is it still a socialist country? Why is it in existence when the Soviet Union is no longer in existence? I know you have an entire chapter in your book about it, so any kind of like highlights in that regard?
I've also written a book on this subject.
Oh, yes, Lessons from the Soviets. Sorry, what was the title of that book you mentioned?
The End of the Beginning, Lessons of the Soviet Collapse. And obviously, it's a big and highly contentious topic. And I think what's important to note for our purposes today is that the Chinese leadership studied the process of deterioration and degeneration and ultimately collapsed the Soviet Union over the course of many decades. And I think a lot of what China has done has been informed by that process, by learning from negative example. Why did the Soviet Union collapse? It's really complicated. It's multifactorial. There's a lot of components to it. There's an economic component. There was a level of stagnation in the Soviet Union from probably the mid-1970s onwards. People had come to expect a pretty rapid increase in living standards, and that tapered off at a time when in significant parts of the capitalist world, obviously in the US, but also Japan, South Korea, it was a time when living conditions were increasing for large layers of the population, like not necessarily for the poorer sections of the working class and not necessarily for oppressed communities, but there was a large kind of middle-income population that enjoyed better living conditions than they ever had. And I think probably you could reasonably say that the Soviet Union didn't really successfully adapt to the post-war reality. Like, they didn't really transition from this kind of emergency mode that they'd been in throughout the 20s, 30s, 40s. You obviously had the revolution, the war of intervention, then, a bit of breathing space with a new economic policy, then a realization of the need for very, very rapid development. And hence from 1929 onwards, large-scale industrialization and socialist construction, essentially in preparation for the war. Then you have a war, an incredibly destructive war in which so much of their infrastructure is wiped out, along with an estimated 27 million people. and then rebuilding post-war. For all of that time, they were in emergency mode, and transitioning from that to a kind of sustainable model of socialism. When they didn't have any, it's not like they had any examples to follow. They were the trailblazers, right? That's the first socialist country. So the whole thing is very experimental. The economy previously, like the economy in the 1930s, it was incredibly successful, grew at an extraordinary rate, but it was a very simple economy. If you look at the product mix, it was like a few dozen products. Fast forward to the 50s and 60s, where people's expectations have changed, like they think they can rely basically on a peaceful environment. The product mix is several hundred, and all of a sudden that becomes a lot more difficult to manage. And I think probably it's fair to say that like a completely centrally planned economy just didn't really deliver on that goal at that time, which is not to say that they could have done what the Chinese have done, because ultimately there's no magic wand. And what the Chinese did was based, in terms of reform, in terms of opening up, was based on very specific circumstances of time and place that allowed them to do what they did. But either way, I think the Soviet Union, because it wasn't delivering to the extent that people expected on the economic side, the system lost a level of popular legitimacy. For about 90% of the population, when you're outside of a revolutionary situation, when you're outside of a revolutionary crisis, most people are focused on, is there food on the table? Are my kids going to school and getting a good education? Am I going to be looked after in old age? And so on. The Chinese leadership studied the Soviet experience, and they understood the crucial importance of delivering in terms of people's expectations for a better quality of life. In delivering on that and in figuring out how to deliver at that, I think compared to what the Soviets did, particularly under Gorbachev, the Chinese took a very experimental, a very cautious approach. They had this whole saying of crossing the river by feeling the stones. And, it was extremely successful because, at the time the Soviet Union was collapsing, like 1991, the economy was contracting at a rate of 15% a year. The Chinese economy was growing at a rate of 10% a year. Like, aside from the economic aspect, there's an ideological and political aspect, right? The Soviet Union was suffering from a level of ideological decay, which, again, controversial, but I think that starts basically with Khrushchev's leadership. And as a result of kind of wanting to build support for his own ideas and for his own leadership, he introduced very suddenly, kind of out of nowhere, out of the blue, a hugely exaggerated critique of Stalin. And I don't know if you've seen the new translation of the LeftWord book, History and Critique of a Black Legend. Very good, definitely something that I'd recommend. But, it's like Khrushchev and the people around him, they identified some genuine problems around revolutionary legality and the cult of the personality and so on. And clearly there were things that needed to change. Like, I think in general, the problems of the time were probably a manifestation of the situation up to that period. Like in the 1930s, with the build-up to war, what Michael Parenti refers to as siege socialism, the post-war situation probably did demand a certain level of political reform, but Khrushchev handled the situation in this kind of characteristically buffoonish and blustering way, and in so doing damaged the basic ideological fabric of Soviet society at that time. The period of Stalin's leadership ran from the early 1920s to the early 1950s. So it's like the vast majority of the period of the Soviet Union's existence up to that point, the period of socialist construction, the period of World War II and the defeat of the Nazi war machine, the period of the Soviet Union's emergence as a superpower. That very blunt and unsophisticated critique affected popular confidence and affected the way people thought about the system. And, it's very meaningful what Deng Xiaoping says in his interview with Oriana Fallaci, the Italian journalist, that, we will not do to Chairman Mao what Khrushchev did to Stalin. And then, it's the 1980s. Gorbachev comes along with these very nice sounding ideas of perestroika and glasnost. In the process, he promotes all his cronies in the name of pushing reform forward. And as part of that, he ends up quite systematically marginalizing the Communist Party, marginalizing the working class, empowering, this emerging entrepreneurial class that's got a material interest in ending socialism. So not only did the reforms create this social class, but the political reforms basically handed it power. And, ultimately they put an end to the Communist Party's leading role in society. And I think China learned very, very clear lessons from that. That, you can have economic reforms, you can introduce market elements, But to contain that risk, to contain that danger, the workers' state has to remain in place. Capital has to remain accountable to the people. There's a nice little quote from Deng Xiaoping about this idea of political reforms towards liberalization, where he says, if China allowed bourgeois liberalization, there would inevitably be turmoil. We'd accomplish nothing, and our principles, policies, line and development strategy would all be doomed to failure. And, in 1978, when they started the economic reform, it was done on the basis of what they called the 4 cardinal principles that were considered we need to follow these, otherwise our reform is going to fail and, our socialist project is going to end. So that's, firstly, we defend the socialist path. 2, we maintain working class rule. We maintain the dictatorship of the proletariat. 3, we maintain the leadership of the CPC. 4, we adhere to Marxism-Leninism. We adhere to Mao Zedong thought. You can see the results of that today. If you look at the mid to late 1980s, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had lost the bulk of its prestige and had lost the bulk of its authority. Fast forward to 2023 in China, where China's economic reforms have gone orders of magnitude further than Soviet reforms ever did economically. But politically, the CPC retains its prestige, retains its authority. Indeed, it's extremely popular. And yet capitalists are admitted to the party, but they're a relatively very small number. And the idea is essentially to be able to better exercise control over them. We have this expression in England, I guess it translates reasonably well across the Atlantic, which is better to have people inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. So, capitalists are not allowed to organize separately. They're not allowed their own political party in China. They're not allowed to organize towards capitalist restoration. And in terms of foreign policy, there's a lot of things that the Chinese learned from the Soviet Union, from the Soviet decline. I think the US strategists, the likes of Brzezinski and Kissinger, and then Reagan, they detected a certain weakness, an emerging weakness in the Soviet Union in the 1970s. And they decided to push their advantage. They lured the Soviets into an arms race. They essentially engineered the Afghanistan war such that it would be drawn out for as long as possible and that they'd use it to defeat the Soviet Union. I think it was Kissinger who said, we're going to give the Russians their Vietnam, or perhaps it was Brzezinski. But meanwhile, the Soviet Union had kind of positioned itself, very honorably. And, I can't say that it was an incorrect thing, but the Soviet Union had positioned itself as leader of the world revolution. They were giving massive support to Vietnam, to Cuba, to Ethiopia, to the European people's democracies, a lot of support to the liberation struggles in South Africa and so on. And in all these cases, the Soviet Union was helping people to face up to US aggression, US coercion. And in the process, the Soviet Union made huge sacrifices. There was a period where it was spending, maybe 20% of its GDP on supporting other progressive and socialist countries. China, by comparison, has been able to enjoy a period of relative peace for the last 50 years or so, especially since restoring its United Nations seat in 1971, the Kissinger visit to Beijing in 71, the Nixon visit in 72, which set that process of rapprochement in train. Obviously, a big part of China's opening up process was to become integrated into the global economy, which was, strategically significant because China's involvement in the global economy has made it very difficult, very costly for the West to attack it. If the West goes to war against China, or undermines China, or it brings about regime change in China, obviously that creates chaos in China. But it also creates chaos for the global economy, which mainly serves the United States and its allies, which is a problem the West has still got today, right? When it's talking about decoupling or de-risking or whatever, it can't actually do it because of China's level of integration into the global economy. China's obviously avoided getting involved in military conflicts, and it's positioned itself very differently regarding the world revolution. China's anti-imperialism in the modern era is much more based around supporting multipolarity, developing kind of friendly relations and mutually beneficial cooperation such that countries of the global south can kind of choose their own development path, a development path that suits their own interests and conditions, rather than having to swallow whatever the West, the US, the IMF, the World Bank want to impose on them. So, and in that way, like China benefits from all these relationships as well. They talk about win-win foreign policy. And as a result, China's not kind of overextended in the way the Soviet Union was, like, even in spite of the situation that we're in now, where China's facing an escalating new Cold War, it's facing an escalating campaign of encirclement and containment. China's still only spending a very small proportion of its GDP on its military. China's population is 4 times that of the US, but its military budget is like a quarter of that of the US. China's studied the Soviet deterioration and Soviet collapse in great detail and learned as much as it possibly can. And I think that's a major part of the reason why the People's Republic of China still exists and is still thriving. And, the CPC is still got its legitimacy, still got its authority, continues to be extremely popular, and continues to deliver for the Chinese people.
Thanks for that very thorough answer, Carlos. Earlier in your response, you did mention the recent translation of Domenico Lacerdo's Stalin, A History and Critique of a Black Legend. That translation was done by Henry Huckabee and Salvatore Di Engelmauro, I believe his name is. I actually had a discussion with them a couple days ago for the podcast. So definitely people will be able to check that out as well to learn more about that book, but also encourage people to read it too. During this period when China is beginning its reforms and, engaging with the US in the 70s, what was the Soviet Union's position on all of this? Were they saying that you guys are now revisionists, or what was going on with the different major socialist movements in regards to China's opening up?
It's a very interesting and very complicated and complex question, because since 1960 or so, China and the Soviet Union had disastrously bad relationship. The Sino-Soviet split started brewing in the mid to late 1950s, kind of came out into the open in 1960, and continued essentially until the mid to late 80s, when Deng Xiaoping and Gorbachev kind of buried the hatchet after a few years of cautious discussions and negotiations between the two sides. The split was sort of formally ended in 1989 when Gorbachev visited Beijing, actually, which was concurrent with the Tiananmen Square protests, which is its own interesting history. In terms of the kind of rapprochement with the US, the way China analyzed the situation at the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s was that its geopolitical situation was extremely fragile, and it faced kind of incredible threat and danger from multiple sources. It obviously had terrible relations with the US, and the US at that time was still defined as the number one enemy, the number one imperialist power. But in the context of the Sino-Soviet split, the Soviet Union had also become an enemy. And my personal view is that the Chinese overstated the kind of physical threat of that. But, there is also no doubt that the Soviet Union were massing large numbers of troops at this very long border between the Soviet Union and China, and were sounding the Americans out about the possibility of coordinating against China. So I think the Sino-Soviet split was a kind of historically disastrous thing for the global working class movement, in many ways, which we're still kind of trying to recover from as a movement, and was a major setback. And I think the Soviet Union was responsible to a significant degree, and I think China was also responsible to a significant degree. But, it was a fact of history. And at that point in time, the Chinese felt a strong need to break their isolation politically, militarily, economically. The Soviet Union had obviously been a massive supporter economically of socialist China. And in the 1950s, there was massive economic and military aid from Moscow to Beijing, which very suddenly went away, like Khrushchev withdrew aid and withdrew all the economic advisors at the start of the Great Leap Forward in 1958 or 1959. The Chinese found themselves without any kind of support for their development, for their modernization, and, with basically constant threat of war from all angles. I think in terms of the rapprochement with the US, that was based on analysis that, we need to reduce our number of enemies. Obviously, historically, we're not on the same side as the US, but we kind of need to have peaceful coexistence with them. Meanwhile, Nixon had said that he wanted to fix the relationship with China. There was a certain amount of momentum towards normalization because the countries of the global south, particularly African countries, had been very strongly supporting China's bid to have its seat restored at the UN General Assembly and the Security Council. So the time was right, it turned out, and with the help of various friends, particularly with the help of and mediation of Pakistan and de Gaulle in France to some degree, the two sides came together and they were able to set in train a process of rapprochement. And that politically more stable relationship with the US and a reduction in the level of threat and a recognition by the US of the One China principle, and some, even if it was a tacit recognition via the Shanghai Communique of the People's Republic's sovereignty over Taiwan, meant that there was the basis for an economic relationship, and that China was able to draw some investment from the US and from Hong Kong and from Japan and from Singapore and from other places, and develop its science and technology, engage in technology transfer, learn from advanced kind of capitalist Western techniques, and so on. As for what the Soviets thought of what was going on in China economically, certainly I don't know to what degree the Soviets really commented on that. The Soviets were obviously engaged in their own experiments. There was the Lieberman reforms in the 1960s, and then from 1985 onwards, the Perestroika reforms. But, there were various little experiments and projects in the Soviet Union to see if they could leverage market mechanisms in order to improve their economic situation, none of which very successful, it has to be said. I don't know if they were in a particularly strong position to say, well, what the Chinese are doing is anti-Marxist. Certainly they had things to say about the China's rapprochement with the US, and they felt that was very much targeted against them. And certainly as far as the US saw it, that is to a significant degree the case. The US was trying to triangulate. They were happy to try and ally with the Soviet Union against China, and they were happy to try and ally with China against the Soviet Union. They're playing their particular game. The Chinese, by the late 60s and early 70s, wanted peaceful coexistence with the US, and so did the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union never gave up on the idea of peaceful coexistence with the West. That's a quite controversial term in the communist movement, but actually it starts with Lenin. Lenin wanted the Soviet Union to peacefully coexist with the West once it became clear that we weren't on the cusp of global revolution. Stalin certainly didn't want the Cold War following World War II. From 1945, it wasn't the West, it wasn't the Soviet Union that pushed the Cold War. It was the US, it was the West, it was Europe that pushed the Cold War. Yeah, the Soviet Union would have had substantial critique of what China was doing, but I don't think they were standing on particularly strong ground. And I think Deng Xiaoping probably summed the whole situation up very concisely but very well when speaking to Gorbachev in '89, talking about the emergence of the Sino-Soviet split and this very intense kind of public debate that they had in the international communist movement. He said something along the lines of, but both sides were talking rubbish. That is, to a considerable degree, the case.
Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for parts 2 and 3 of my discussion with Carlos Martinez on China. Until next time.